Hello. So this is going to be a pretty short overview. The idea of reverse engineering one of these pages, coming up with a structure, involves figuring out what the basic lengths are. And when you're looking at these things, one obvious choice is the center of any circle. The centers would have to have been constructed so that they could make them. And you notice how you have these concentric circles here. So these points wouldn't have been guessed at, they would have been constructed. So if you start with that idea, and then you start looking around, the idea being that you want to figure out some basic unit of measurement. And so, also to jump to the chase here, you tried a whole bunch, but on this particular panel, this measurement, the radius from the center to the second circle here, appears like a good candidate, and ends up being the width of, say, like these panels. So why is that important? Well, you can imagine that if this radius is an important length, that then this circle would fit inside of 4 boxes, and then these panels here would fit inside of some number of boxes. These circles would fit inside 4 boxes. And then you start looking around the piece of paper, you'll see there's all kinds of other places where this makes sense. There'd be a box right here and a box right there. So 4 boxes, box here, 4 boxes, boxes stacked up here. You look at this square has that fundamental measurement on both sides. So we're getting a sense that this is some component of the grid. Now the grid is much finer than that, as you can see with all this very fine detail. But it gives us a basic way of setting up the page. So if I draw lines connecting the centers of all these circles, and I draw lines connecting the edges of them, pretty soon I find that I'm constructing a grid where these lines line up with lots of other borders. There's lots of corroborating evidence here that this box is part of the fundamental grid underlying this page layout. Now, as you'll see in a minute, again, this is just one sort of coarse structure. There are finer structures at work here. But this is really important because it allows us to get the proportions. At a minimum, I'm going to want 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 squares across. Preferably, I probably want 12, right? So I'd have a square here, another square on either side that I would subdivide. So 12 squares ideally. And then as far as going top to bottom, at a minimum, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. But really, I probably want a couple more squares top and bottom to catch these corner details. So probably 2 more at the top, 2 more at the bottom, probably 15. And so if I can construct a grid that's, say, 12 by 15 squares, I'll have all the information I need to make the page. So what does that look like? Well, here's an example that I've been working on. This was the example that made me decide that this would really be better as an extra credit sort of option until I can find some simpler pages in future semesters. So you'll notice I constructed my grid here. I've got plenty of boxes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It could have 11 here, could have 12 over here. And from top to bottom, I have plenty. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. I have plenty of boxes. And so I've been able to set up those circles. Those circles are all constructed on here. The very bottom one is just penciled in. But I have them, and they're well proportioned. I have made some errors. I found it very easy to make little errors when inking over some of the final pieces. So this isn't quite right. And another part of the problem is that the easiest way to create the properly proportioned borders here, which we figure out incidentally, using that initial measurement. So if we go back to the photocopy, as we start poking around, we have these borders, and we can ask, well, are they related to this basic measurement? And there's a couple ways of figuring that out. Simple folding will do. This is half of the radius, and then I can easily get a quarter just with folding. The benefit of doing this, why wouldn't I just measure with a ruler? Well, there's a couple of reasons. If you take a measurement here and it's some fraction of a millimeter, maybe it's 2.3 or something, and then maybe this is 1.7. As you're subdividing further or multiplying, you're going to have all kinds of rounding errors, and it's pretty hard to estimate fractions of millimeters. So here, I don't actually care how many millimeters this is. I also don't care because I'm not trying to replicate an exact copy. This is a scale copy. My squares may be a slightly different size than those squares. That's not important. But look here. These borders are a quarter of this fundamental measurement. These end up being about 1/8. You can kind of see right there, half of a quarter. And so when I look around at these things, right, the inside of this panel is a half of R. There are all sorts of other measurements that are based off this box size. And the way I approach that is, when I want to set up these borders, I subdivide the squares of my grid just using diagonals like I showed in class. And I can subdivide those squares really, really fine. And so I can get eighths and quarters and whatnot really easily. But you can see that the detail is quite fine. And this grid, even though it looks quite subdivided, these squares are just a couple millimeters on each side. That's not as fine as it needs to be. And if you consider the fine detail at further scales, especially within these circles, these fine little spiral designs. So, and even though it's quite likely that these smaller ones were freehanded, if you consider the division, this is clearly divided up into fourths, and then these remaining parts, or I guess eighths really, right? There's 4 circles, and there's 4 other parts, and those parts have little circles evenly spread out. Plenty of symmetry. So there's some further subdivisions going on within these circles. So in many ways, it's it's not hard. It's some of you might find it quite fun to try to find the scale and then find the proportions of the grid that make up the page, and then to recreate that grid, and then by using this ad hoc measuring scale here, compare pieces of the original design, figure out what your subdivisions need to be on this design, and then start placing them in. And it's certainly the kind of thing I would like to have time to do a facsimile of myself. I will note that this is definitely a case where if you have the opportunity, you can do this with a pencil and a pen. I'm using one of these Micron pens. The benefit of something like this is that when you hold the pen down, it doesn't leak out ink. So you can see it doesn't make a big splotch. And you can get them in different sizes. So that's handy. It would have been nice I didn't have a harder graphite, because there's so much pencil down here that as you're moving your ruler around, you get lots of rub-off effects. So, and this is a 0.5 millimeter pencil. It would have been nice to have a 0.2 millimeter of a harder graphite, so it wouldn't rub off as much. So those would be nice. Also, it certainly helps if you get a chance to try to sharpen. Mine's dulling here. Sharpen the tip of your lead on your compass to make more precise lines. So I'm not entirely sure what I'm looking for. I suppose if you're interested in doing this, take a look at the Book of Kells or the Lindisfarne Gospels or some other illuminated texts. If you find a page you're interested in, we can chat about it. Something like this is probably homework worthy right about now. It's a couple hours of work. It requires plenty of figuring and thinking. if you were to recreate the entire thing with all the borders, and then maybe some of the circular designs, or recreate one of the circles, and do some original knotwork in one of the panels. Again, I wouldn't expect the entire thing. That would take weeks. But we might be able to do something where you leave part of the panel penciled, and then part of the panel inked, and then maybe part of the panel decorated. So if you're interested in that, just approach me and we can talk about what sort of options there might be.